Right. So thank you all for joining us today. We are joined by Kaylin Narita, who is an interdisciplinary researcher interested in dissecting the relationship between digital technologies, borders, and ethics. She's currently a postdoctoral research assistant on the Humane Project, which I'm leading with a little team, and we are building open educational resources around ethical AI. Kaylin's doctoral research thesis unearths the so-called digital hostile environment and the technological implication of the UK's migration governance to disperse border control to public institutions and citizens. Her work emphasizes the impact of private actors and explores embedded bias in technology, and that's what we'll be learning about today. So I'll pass over to Kaylin. Anything else you want to say to introduce yourself, and feel free to share your slides.
Okay, just sharing. Is that all good?
Yep, looks good.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation, and I'm really excited to kind of be here today and talk everyone through some of the research I recently did for my PhD thesis, as Anna just mentioned. I was looking at the use, particularly of automated decision-making systems in the UK context, and I want to focus today on this idea of outsourcing. So when we think about outsourcing in border space, sometimes there's kind of a lot of different types of outsourcing. So anyone who's familiar with the UK context, you'll remember that the past Conservative government was also trying to outsource asylum application accommodation to Rwanda. There's the outsourcing in terms of using military force at border control. But today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different and something that maybe people don't think about when we think about borders, which is kind of this administration side to border control. And this is what was the focus mainly of my work, and trying to think through how private actors, mainly private technology companies, were used by the Home Office, which is the main immigration control, the main governmental body in the UK that controls immigration. So today, for the first talk, as I said, maybe we'll have a little bit, I'll try and speak for a bit less time because there's not as many of us today. So hopefully we can have more of a discussion Q&A at the end. So really, hopefully it could be helpful for everybody to just ask questions, and I'll just get through as much as I can. So first, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the challenges and context of researching borders, and especially when we're trying to understand this relationship between digital technology and border control. And then I'm going to think about how maybe we can situate the impact of private actors when we're thinking about how kind of concepts of markets and private interests now intersect at this public space. And then finally, I'm going to finish with an example that I used during my PhD work. That was the use of a more automated case working system called Atlas. So really, this is going to be, again, the focus on more back-end tools of things that maybe we don't see or think about as we cross borders. And particularly thinking about the impact this might have on visa applicants. So really, the question of my research kind of began about this broad idea of what is this relationship between borders and digital technology. And I think when we think about borders, a lot of the times there's certain images that kind of come to our minds. And also when we have this kind of concept of like a smart border, something that is more fluid and technologically enforced, this is kind of like this idea of like science fiction, kind of something that is out there. But really, it's really important to begin with this kind of concept that border practices have always been obscured from the public. So I don't know if anyone here has ever gone through the process of applying for a visa. It's not always the best experience, but often you'll never really fully know the different practices and steps and standards that were used for you to have to reach this final outcome. All you're going to see is kind of the yes or no. You can come and visit, you can come and live in this country, but you will never fully understand kind of the different steps that were taken to reach that decision. So this is kind of based on the historical practice, and also is part of this. So no kind of decision at the border is ever going to be neutral. It's kind of built off a longer process of historical notions of belonging. So this is really to say that borders themselves are political technologies that are really focusing on um, always maintaining this order between the division between us and them, so that there's never kind of this neutral entity that could be a border, that they're always kind of infused with this political mediation between, ranking good mobility or good trades or good flows of materials even. So these are always going to be what the border is kind of dealing with. And so this is also to say that often we think maybe about how things are stopped at borders, but it's important to understand that borders themselves are very porous, that actually what they're kind of created to do is to filter and prioritize different people. So this isn't to say that everything is about stopping mobility, but it's really about kind of filtering and becoming porous. So kind of who's allowed in and who's allowed out, and who is going to be prioritized in that space. And it's really important for us to also think about how borders can appear one day, that when the borders can kind of come out of nowhere and are always being constantly renegotiated. So again, in the UK context, one way for us to think about this is that when the UK decided to leave the EU, this meant that a new border appeared within the UK for citizens who were EU citizens that were living in the UK and previously didn't have to apply or need any kind of extra legal document to prove that they were allowed to be in the country, but they were kind of living under this kind of free mobility that was under the EU regulations. So after this reformation, this kind of meant that the UK now had this border and a new political negotiation of who belongs. So this is also kind of one of the kind of a way for us to start thinking about also how technology is kind of increasingly being used at borders. So kind of from this understanding that these border practices are always moving, they're never going to be fully transparent, this becomes even more complicated when we add in the kind of understanding that technical systems themselves are going to be add this new layer of opacity. And in kind of keeping on the same example of the 6 million EU citizens that had to apply for residency after Brexit, the Home Office decided the best way to do this kind of reconfiguration of the border was to use an automated decision-making system. An automated decision-making systems kind of broadly refer to the use of some kind of process that is automated, so meaning like data analytics, using algorithms or other machine learning practices, either with a human that is in the loop, so a human that's just interacting with this system, or there can be fully automated decision-making systems as well. So in the case of the EU citizens and the automated decision-making system, this was kind of considered a human in the loop. So and now this kind of process has been revealed as like a fantastic success, even though there have been cases of errors for this system. But again, it kind of shows us this new practice of using technological solutions to kind of create and make borders relevant in certain spaces. So this kind of new layer of technology is kind of what I'm really considering, is what happens when there becomes this increased focus on only the outcome of systems and decisions, and how do we kind of start to complicate the more of the standards and the practices that reached us to this. So often I think about kind of these technical systems being black boxed, as if we think about and how us as users are usually not really aware of different things going on. If you think about using like Spotify, the music platform, maybe you're kind of focusing on like really fun new playlists that they're curating for you. You're going to see the outcome of like the playlist curing the Monday blues. You're not really thinking about what kind of processes and decisions and rankings were being used by Spotify, nor will you ever really know how that decision was reached. You're just going to be enjoying your new playlist on Monday. But this also kind of increases your kind of inability to question and critique how this, in our case, a playlist, but now in other cases, is going to be kind of dictating larger life-altering decisions. So now that we kind of have this kind of complication and we've kind of made this situation of borders more complicated and understood that they're never going to be fully transparent nor neutral. I wanted to just give a bit of a context on the hostile environment, which is kind of a name for a series of policies that was intensified in 2012 when then Home Secretary Theresa May kind of issued and declared that the Home Office and the larger UK government was going to aim to make the internal space of the UK a very hostile place for people who don't have secure status. And what this meant in practice was that the UK government began to turn in immigration checks into everyday spaces. So this in practice looked like involving public institutions. So this is like the National Health Service, Department of Vehicles Licensing Agency, so people's driver's license and records of ownerships of cars, HMRC, which is the tax agent here, so using tax records as a way of verifying residency and looking at employment records, and also even going to school. So all of these kind of spaces now become part of a larger apparatus of border control. And really what this is to, and also beyond just those public spaces, we also have private citizens like landlords and employers now becoming complicit in checking people's immigration control. So this meant that landlords, when they're renting to a family or to a private tenant, they were then now required to check that person's status. And if they fail to do so, they could face fines and a certain amount of penalty time. So this is to say this kind of accumulation of bringing that kind of control of that we often think about just at the exteriors of a country internally. This kind of was critiqued as going to be kind of relying on these on very like racialized and stereotypical notions of belonging. So when you outsource the kind of role of a border agent to individuals like a medical professional or a school teacher, often the people who are going to be asked to prove their status, that's going to rely on stereotypical notions of people who look or appear British or have a British sounding name. So this is going to kind of have that kind of tugging and erosion of social belonging. And again, this is to say that the hostile environment series of policies was not something that was something that was very much contested by civil society actors based on kind of this understanding that this internalization was going to have these kind of bias impacts on communities. And so here's a van that that charity Liberty did to parody and resist one of the most blatant kind of racialized practices the Home Office used during the height of the hostile environment policies, which was essentially the Home Office would drive vans that looked like this, but had a very different message on the side of the van that essentially told people that they should go home, and if they were in the country, quote unquote, illegally, that they would face fines and penalties. And the Home Office deliberately drove these vans through ethnically diverse neighborhoods in London. So again, this is like we kind of have this critique that the landlords, employers, medical doctors, they may be using stereotypical or racialized logics to conduct these checks, but also you have this kind of underlying racialized, deliberate kind of spreading of fear as one of the main technologies of the hostile environment. And kind of all of this came to crux with what's now known as the Windrush scandal, which is a name for kind of the thousands of mainly Caribbean descendants that were wrongly stripped of their citizenship rights after they were kind of classified as not having the correct status of being in the UK. Now there's very poor data about how many people were affected, but the charity Action for Race Equality estimates that around 57,500 people and their children were impacted by the Windrush scandal, which is essentially the Home Office kind of using these retroactive practices to strip people of their kind of ability. And it meant that a lot of individuals would lose access to their pensions or their state housing, even as we said, like as the border was everywhere, could even lose support in medical attention, and in some extreme cases were actually removed from the country. So all of this kind of as the Windrush scandal became more widely publicized, the Home Office kind of saw this as like a major political fallout and said that actually they're going to kind of brand the hostile environment, change some of the policies, so that it's now this kind of quote unquote compliance environment rather than hostile. Um, but really, when we kind of think about and we visualize this space, um, the very much still in today's kind of migration context, all of these spaces still are very much immigration checks. So we have this very benign GP's office. Again, this is going to be sharing data with the Home Office. My previous university, which is not a diss to this university, it's all universities are also still required to kind of track and monitor immigrate international students. Here we have a marriage registries office, which is another kind of new face of this border. And we also have this kind of online portal, which is like the new face that we're going to be focusing for the rest of the talk as kind of the face of bordering control. So kind of the way in which let's just say so the way in which all of these kind of spaces become border control agents is this kind of underlying infrastructure of data sharing. So it kind of is the way in which we're able to make these, or the Home Office is able to make a GP's office an immigration control check is by this increasing reliance on data sharing and data access to individuals. And from this creation of a changing the face and the space of internalized border control checks, the core question becomes not only how data sharing is part of the border control checks, but also what does it mean as technological solutions are increasingly being used to, like, quote unquote, solve migration problems. And one of the new biggest attentions for civil society is that post Windrush scandal and post kind of the formal end of the hostile environment, we're not really seeing anything change day to day. We're actually just seeing this transition maybe to less physical spaces like vans driving through neighborhoods, but more of this kind of uploading this hostility, uploading this technology of fear onto digital platforms. And what this means really, so I think my slide has cut off the name of the organization, but Open Rights Group has started to campaign against the use of the e-visa scheme and has said that this is going to lead to what they call a digital Windrush scandal. So essentially, again, this kind of stripping of rights, perhaps unforeseen consequences of using digital platforms. And the e-visa scheme is the turn of the Home Office trying to is essentially, as of this year, all anyone who has a visa in the UK will no longer have a physical document. So, so like a piece of paper in your passport, a biometrics card, something that you can hold and touch and show an individual when you're being asked to prove your immigration status. This is now all going to be hosted by an online portal called the e-visa. And the core kind of critique is that this uploading and relying on these digital systems can lead to this degradation of stability of rights. So, you know, what happens when these systems break? what happens when people don't have that access or kind of computer, I think there's a word for it, computer literacy, to kind of navigate these more complex online forms. And the other element that is increasingly being critiqued in this space of the, so-called digital hostile environment is that not only will data sharing kind of perpetuate fear, but also increasingly these kind of structures are introducing more automated processing of decision making. So we already heard about how EU citizens were processed through automated decision making, but these kind of algorithmic governance tools are used throughout kind of migration governance. So from this kind of understanding of some of the major critiques of the hostile environment, and also how border control has increasingly become internalized in the space of the UK, I think it's important to also kind of renegotiate how private actors have historically interacted with borders and have historically also incorporated other private actors. So maybe when we think about border spaces, maybe border surveillance as well, we could think about, fences or, security cameras or, uh, I guess like the very big trope of like, Trump's wall back in 2016. So something like very physical that we can see that is about halting and like spotting people at that external frontier. And that space of the external border has always relied on private actors. So these private actors could range from security forces to individual private actors working in immigration detention centers. And increasingly, we're seeing this kind of portal, this like robo surveillance kind of tool here is from the Anduril company, which is really much dominating the US defense sector. And essentially, it's being deployed in the US-Mexico border space to try and create this all-seeing and like all surveillance space. So we kind of see this very visceral surveillance assemblage in terms of cameras and stopping mobility and viewing mobility at the external. So, but now our kind of key question to rethink this space and rethink this militarized area is to say, well, we know that border checks don't just happen, when we're going through Heathrow through these automated gates. They're kind of happening throughout everyday life. So what does this mean? How does this kind of change the face of the border? And I think a really great book that helps us theorize both the changing nature of technology and changing nature of technology companies and their interest in the border space is this Data Borders by Melissa Via-Nicholas. And I've included this quote as I think it does a really fantastic job to think about not only how this physical infrastructure of surveillance is being capitalized by private actors in the US context, but also that there's this new drive to kind of see data as this raw material and way to kind of transform physical tools into these data surveillance tools, and that this is kind of the new gaze of that is being perpetuated at borders. So this is what Via-Nicholas calls the military industrial startup complex, and that the private actors themselves aren't just benefiting through just the one-off contract, but they're also being able to build, more accurate, more sophisticated abilities to sense and use these kind of surveillance data networks. So this kind of helps us, I think, bridge into why it's significant that private actors are entering into this more back-end border administration. So this is kind of the new face and the face that will focus for the rest of the talk in this of borders. And so this is, again, how can we see this similar tangible surveillance, but maybe now in forms that will look like what we interact maybe with on a day-to-day basis on our own computers. So so as I mentioned, now with the e-visa scheme, employers are now given a share code or an access code when they're employing somebody that needs to prove their right to work. So this is again what it will look like for employers now when they're hiring an individual. So this is kind of again, how do we see that kind of surveillance practice in this internal bordering check of kind of this between private individuals. And this again is a algorithmic tool that's being used to monitor and suggest different interventions that should be undertaken in terms of immigration enforcement. So if you see here again, so things like barriers, harms, family shares, and vulnerability, this is another way in which people are being categorized and seen by the border agents. And this is really to say as well that it helps us understand that borders aren't just these fences, but these administrative structures. So often when we think about bureaucracy, we think about maybe like faceless agents and like this endless paperwork. But this kind of whole image of bureaucracy is now being uploaded onto forms that look very much like this. And this is kind of playing into that a big part of borders are going to be these administrative processes. And this really brings into the question of how algorithm and algorithmic bias are going to be a key kind of agent in shaping how individuals are seen under this new kind of surveillance gaze. So often we think about, but the computer said so. So that's kind of why the decision was reached. So again, like you can think about how an often analogy that is maybe imperfect, but it is quite helpful is that algorithms are very much like recipes. They're kind of a series of instructions that are given to a computer, and then you're again just focusing on that output and that kind of structure, that end result. But rather, we're kind of how can we ask more questions about what those ingredients are and how does that kind of recipe come to be if we're kind of really dragging out that analogy. So on the screen we have just again to like visualize. I think often algorithms are seen as this like very scary, something that we can't really fully understand, but this is what a contested algorithm called the streaming tool would look like if you were an individual who was working at the Home Office at the time it was being used. So the streaming tool was kind of said to was contested by the JCWI and Foxglove as being discriminatory as it used nationality as a direct input to create these risk assessment for a visa applicant. So essentially, if you were applying for a visa, you were kind of put into this system and gone through a series of and then your information would be matched to this algorithm and it would kind of pop out this red rating for the caseworker. And so this is no longer in use, but it is a really good example for us to kind of think that, you know, even though this was just a red rating for an individual and maybe wouldn't always lead to them not being accepted as a visa applicant, you know, this kind of shows, again, this kind of face of the algorithmic bureaucracy. And it leads to the question, you know, is this working, as Boyali says, creating this more of an ignorance of those kind of faceless, nameless paperwork bureaucrats, or is there something else kind of going on here? Is this just about automating bias because you're inserting racial features into creating this risk assessment? And another really important way I think to think about this and why it's really important to look at these kind of more minute and mundane practices is because this is all part of this larger infrastructure. And this is a really great way for us to maybe how can we become more proactive in terms of researching algorithmic systems. So often we only think about infrastructural structures like trains or roads when they don't work because of this privilege bias. So, you know, you don't really think about all the networks and all the people and all the goods that kind of had to all go right to get you onto the train to Stansted when the train arrives on time. But that kind of infrastructure of trains becomes very, very apparent to you when you left too late and now Stansted Express isn't going to come to the airport in time. So this is all to say that when we kind of have this emphasis on the infrastructure of decision making and the infrastructure of how algorithms are being created, this kind of lets us think more kind of predictive about what kind of infrastructure is shaping these politics and how these digital systems are being constructed. And this is always, I like to say that infrastructure is this like call to, as Lee Starr says, like the call to the mundane and the study of the boring. So if everybody is kind of like dozing off during my talk, it just means that we're like really deep into the infrastructure, and we're really just into the boring things. So that's always a great way for me to think about infrastructure. So just to kind of get to the meaty bits of my research, this kind of infrastructural lens was very helpful for me when I was researching the case working system, which is also a case study, which is also a hard sentence to say, of Atlas. So Atlas in a crux is essentially this bridge between a visa applicant to the Home Office. So if you're a visa applicant, your kind of outcome of your decision will actually be sent to you from an email called like atlas.uk.homeoffice. So that's very much the bridge that you see to the Home Office. But Atlas is also the system that maybe Home Office caseworkers are, getting in the morning, cup of coffee, logging in. This is what they're going to be interacting with day to day. So again, very much about like workflows, organizing information, all of the really exciting stories and bits. When I was beginning researching Atlas back in 2021, it wasn't in use by the Home Office. It was just being designed. So I tried to use this infrastructural lens to problematize this tool before there were these recorded harms. But now in hindsight, now there are recorded harms for the system, unfortunately, and the harms are mostly based on the fact that there was all these data errors. And one of the biggest kind of steps of the tool and one of the biggest design inputs of the tool was that there was several different contractors that were responsible for delivering this tool. And just based on the contracts that I collected, the is kind of a rough estimate of the cost. But this is expected to be actually quite a lot more than just the contracts I collected. So now I'm going to go through just a series of collections of contracts that I think are relevant for us to kind of think and problematize this relationship even further. And this is kind of a very long quote, which is against the rules when you do a PowerPoint, but I think it's really important to just kind of glance over, as I think these three S's that Zignazio and Klein suggest give us a nice framework to think about how, again, it seems how that this kind of interaction between corporations and and public spaces isn't going to ever be neutral, that both of these kind of have very different goals and interests, but kind of how do we kind of best research these these kind of interests is what I was curious about in my research. So kind of guiding us through these three S's. So to begin very briefly, again, trying to visualize these mundane processes, the first step for the transfer over and the Atlas project began with just transferring over from a previous system to the new system. So the previous system will be here on the left, and the new system, Atlas, is what it will look like on the right. And so this is essentially, again, another way to like remind us that these tools, even though they may not be as flashy as the surveillance drones, they're also still very much part of the surveillance practices. So you're still going to have different ways in which people are being seen and understood by the state. So in this process of changing over from left to right is really where we see our first major misstep with Atlas. So here is just a screen grab of a contract that the Home Office wrote for an agent called Cognant. None of these are particularly, I'm not placing, it's not a blame game in terms of cognizant, it's just intellectual curiosity. Um, but essentially, if we kind of look at these private contracts and tenders from the Home Office, it's a way for us to see how the Home Office is infrastructurally prioritizing certain elements in their design projects. So if you see here, the issue of a mixed identity was placed at priority 3 for cognizant, and this meant that within 3 days this needed to be resolved. But with our hindsight, or kind of our foresight, we now know that the Atlas system had this major issue of having data entry problems, meaning that when people, so if the Home Office was looking up Kaylin Narita, maybe in certain cases, individuals' names were mixed up with different faces. So imagine if you're logging into your e-visa and you see someone else's face and information on your portal, that's not going to be very warm-hearted for you, especially when we know that this means is critical life-altering circumstances for individuals. So this issue of mixed identity, kind of under this guise of science and kind of being contracted out, was seen as a low priority. But without this kind of social context of borderings, this kind of is being erased in terms of when it's issued out to these private actors. And then 2 years down the line, there's kind of this recognition that there's this mixed identity issue, that there's been this issue between transferring over from the old system to the new system. So again, what the Home Office does is it actually just hires more private actors to fix the issue. So this is 2 years later, after this kind of initial program was made. So this again is showing this similar pattern of exporting the responsibility. So who's responsible for when there's these mixed identities? Who actually kind of has this, responsibility for a border for people who are part of this immigration decision. And again, we go back to this kind of push that the more automation and the more algorithms that are being used and hosted by Atlas are going to solve all of the Home Office's issues and all of the problems. And this is really one of the increasingly is becoming known to us is this tool called the immigration identify, prioritize immigration cases. And I think it's a little bit on the nose, the name, meaning I pick. So if you think from the point of view of the algorithm, it's saying like I pick. So I don't know how good of a name that is from the Home Office. But essentially, this was a decision-making support tool, which is saying that it was trying to help immigration enforcement individuals look at a series of different data analytics, different kind of streams of information, and see who within those kind of tools would be able to be removed from the country. So under a series of freedom of information requests, the organization Privacy International kind of got an image of what this kind of tool would look like. And I think it's really important for us to realize here is that this is kind of increasing this reliance and ability to kind of increasing this reliance of the Home Office on this tool. So if a caseworker, on Atlas doesn't agree with what the tool said it should do, they have to go through another series of steps for why they rejected the case. So this is kind of to say, I don't know, if Google tells me to turn left, I turn left, and it's just it kind of increases this relationship between accepting the kind of decision of an algorithm. And even deeper, when we think about who's making these kind of decisions, who's actually creating and understanding how these tools that the case office workers are being kind of encouraged to accept, actually this is created by a private actor itself. So here we kind of do have that embeddedness of the social relations. So the interventions that the company BJSS is going to be making, it's very clear that you have this language that a set of tasks that are going to be performed against a person of interest to facilitate removal from the UK. So we almost have this, there is this kind of understanding that this tool is going to be used into that context of bordering, but we also don't really understand, but how is BJSS as kind of a tech firm, how are they equipped to kind of create and make those recommendations? And this is kind of, again, this another outsourcing of responsibility of how these people, how different people are going to be seen within by the Home Office. And this is kind of the last, so that was kind of, this is kind of the last S of D'Ignazio and Klein, which is selling. So this is a screenshot from BJS's company website in which they're actually able to now market themselves and kind of benefit from their building of a tool that is now kind of using this similar criminalization language of migrants in the UK. So this is kind of this perpetual feedback loop that's happening, that they're not only benefiting from the millions of pounds building the system, but now they're also going to be able to benefit by marketing this as like a profitable tool. So this is kind of, again, the issues of contracting out the borders in a nice three crux that we have, again, this non-prioritization of kind of errors that could happen in the system that would affect people. So this is the mixed identities, bad data quality, and also this, again, you fix it pattern of transferring over responsibility. And again, that this automated process is becoming even more deeply embedded. This is, again, these questions that come up for us. Is this simply about reliance? Is it about accountability? Are these tools kind of set up to create this to fail and not work? Is that kind of part of the logic and the politics of, like, as borders or political technologies? Is this just an extension? And also, like, how do we understand this as like weaponized incompetence, and for both the caseworker to say it was a tool, for the tool to say it was the data, and kind of who's actually responsible and who's actually kind of taking actions when there's quite big life chances at stake. And to always end on a really happy note, I think another really important feature for us to think about is that there's this increasing reliance on like big American data conglomerates, not only at the UK border, but in other spaces in the UK government. And this is basically, again, even further in the back end of tools. So this is like cloud subscriptions, Microsoft 365 subscriptions. But I think it leads us to really important questions about how do we as researchers try and understand how this kind of outsourcing, not only to private actors, but actors that are part of a larger that are based in the US and part of a larger kind of increasingly techno extreme, since it's being recorded, kind of apparatus. And this is kind of something that maybe this is what I left kind of my PhD open to further research. But yes, thank you so much. I've just left a couple of these questions that are on my mind and maybe we can speak about. But I think it's increasingly important to consider these like back-end data infrastructures, as there's seemingly a gluttony for artificial intelligence by not only the border agents, but kind of global governance as well. And that these kind of like mundane features are going to be the building blocks of what artificial intelligence will be able to do. But yeah, that was a lot of information. So if anyone has any questions or wants any materials, just feel free to send me an email.
Hi, Kaylin.
I
I
am.
I just don't really have any questions, but I just wanted to say, I've just done a master's about the impact on British children of having their foreign national parents deported. And your research is quite important because of the sociological impact it's going to have on families and people in their lives, as you said. So I just think it was a really good presentation, and it's made me aware of a whole area of things that I didn't consider in my research because I was looking at socio-economic impact. But I'll really be interested to see how your research develops in the future. Well done.
Well, thank you. That sounds like really interesting research as well. And I definitely, in my work, really focus more on these kind of visa politics and less on that kind of social side. But as much as possible, I try and connect these kind of um, I find it very interesting, but I know it's hard to speak about for an hour about these kind of administrative techniques.
Absolutely is. I read a report from the Children's Commissioner, bearing in mind what you were saying about e-visas, etc., the Children's Commissioner about how the Home Office rules, especially the income thresholds, are keeping families apart. And you might want to just have a look at that Children Commissioner's report because it brings to life what you're saying and shows the direct implications and impact of all these errors.
Yeah. And another major thing that I looked at, that I didn't have time to speak about today is um, the use, and that's kind of why I showed that wedding registry office when we were thinking about the internalized border spaces, is because now the Home Office uses an automated system to dictate which marriage applicants are most likely to be quote unquote fraudulent. So this is like very much, as you said, like how do you, it brings in very big questions about social relations. So how does one kind of dictate what true love is, what kind of love is being done in terms of forsaking immigration control, and all, these are all very much subjective relations that are now being inputted into these kind of automated systems, and very much so like families and income thresholds.
Yeah, the research of Griffiths, she did a very big report on actually how in the Home Office decision letters, it's British women who marry outside of Britain are treated as desperate women who are being like scammed basically and incapable of making a sensible decision regarding choosing a partner. It's really interesting how that dynamic is played out in the Home Office research and in their letters. So
Mhm.
also it's interesting how much of an interface they want to use AI to give because the margin for human error with home office decisions is quite large as well. They tend to cut and paste from one case to the other. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's quite a lot there to explore.
Great. It's really interesting. Sorry I disappeared. I'm not on my computer and I managed to completely lose where I like don't know how the mouse works right now. So yeah, I like lost my buttons. So Julian has a question. I'm gonna stack it with another one, but we'll ask Julian's right after. And if anyone else, just for time, if you have something, feel free to put it in the chat, or if you want to stack it on top, we can give a little pile of questions to Kaylin. But I was curious to hear a little bit about your methodology, which I guess goes a little bit with one of the questions that you asked on that last slide. I mean, I think there's something really innovative going on and with how you were accessing and what you were using, what kinds of documents you're using. And especially if we've got some postgraduates here, it's great to hear about like how those methods work. Julian, do you want to ask yours on the back of that and then we'll come
Yeah,
back?
kind of the same question. I was interested in whether the methodology, um, maybe for this project, but also the new one I know you're involved in with Anna, maybe to what extent is the methodology itself a kind of activism because you deconstruct the infrastructure through the way you do the research that then does more than just see it, but actually one of your questions on the screen about how might the race for AI transform the infrastructure. So it's whether the methodology you're using is part of that transformation of the infrastructure, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this question about methodology, my methodology is very much informed by you, Anna, and your training about using mining back. And as you said, Julian, um, kind of the way I went about this was trying to be as open about my kind of desk research and data practices as possible, as much as possible. So a lot of the kind of resources and empirical kind of screen grabs that you saw today are mostly from public contracts that the Home Office did publish. And also a lot of those have been redacted now, because I had the privilege of looking at this kind of atlas system before there was these recorded harms. So before kind of the iron wall of let's clean up our mess. So us again, I guess you always have to save everything, which I learned from Anna. And also, so kind of again to this open data practices, I created, I'm just sounding like a very big fangirl of Anna today, but kind of creating these kind of actor mapping in the public spaces so that individuals could see, you know, how Deloitte and BJSS, but also other smaller firms are being involved in similar data systems. So like, as you said, kind of, and a lot of like my freedom of information requests that I made, I chose to make it in the public realm so that other kind of activists or people who are interested in similar sites like the IPIC kind of were able to like piggyback on the information that I was given from the system as well. But I think as well, like what I try to do in my research is to think about how the method, again, is not to overemphasize that digital side of it, as we were saying, like that borders themselves are these kind of political technologies, and that we can't think of like, oh, because of the algorithm, that's why it's faulty. You also have to engage with, actually, does the Home Office want these systems to work? You know, how does the Home Office see and prioritize individuals? So that's not just about the technology is working on inputting nationality, but also kind of this is how the state is seeing and viewing the kind of importance of migration governance.
That's really interesting. And I think as we try to keep kind of going to Julian's questions, like as we try to keep up with AI, to be able to do the research, to be able to make the interventions, I think that's going to be really interesting. But I think that the use of, so you were using like procurement databases and like looking at the tenders. And so I think that's a really cool method. And I wonder if that's going to keep or even become more important, because where else are we going to find what's going on with these kind of AI deals? Does anyone else have a last question that's in the audience that hasn't spoken? All right, great. So you've got Kaylin's email if you do want to follow up on anything. This is really fascinating. I'm really glad that sometimes I just invite people to the series because I want to hear them. This was definitely as selfish. So I'm really grateful that I got to hear what you were working on. And I think it's really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to the future of your research and to seeing some of this work get published. Not just because you took my training. It's incredible to see what you've done with it, which is like more than I would ever have imagined when I give that kind of training. So yeah, rewarding for me as well. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Feel free to look at the rest of our events, and we're back next week. And we've got some more talks on AI coming up later in the program as well.
Thank you so much.